Imagine for a moment that you arrived in this life without the interior scaffolding most people never notice they received. No handed-down story of who you are, no inherited constellation of values and fears and certainties quietly assembled by the family before you even had language for such things. Most people who feel this way assume the hollow sensation at their center is damage, a wound, something that happened to them and left a gap where a self should be. But that feeling of structural absence isn't merely a symptom of loss or deprivation. It is, paradoxically, the signature of a rare calling, the involuntary invitation to build a self from the ground up, deliberately and consciously, rather than simply inhabiting one that was pre-furnished. What if the very fact that you cannot borrow your identity from those around you is precisely what makes your eventual coherence something no one can revoke? By the end of this journey, you'll not only understand what it truly means to construct a self from scratch, the final revelation about why this rare path is not a wound at all, but perhaps the most generous form of wholeness a person can carry, is perhaps the most quietly transformative of all. Jung called it the shadow, the vast unlit interior that every human being carries, the repository of everything the psyche has not yet brought into conscious light. For most people, this interior arrives pre-furnished, shaped by the hands of parents, culture, and inherited tradition before any deliberate choice was ever made. The family pours the concrete in the dark, and by the time you are old enough to look down, there is already a floor beneath your feet, solid and navigable, even if you never once chose its composition or examined what lies beneath it. But for the rare person this journey is tracing, the form was left empty. Not because something went wrong in the pouring, but because the particular inheritance that shapes most interiors, the unconscious transmission of persona, of acceptable feeling, of what to suppress and what to display, simply did not arrive. The shadow, rather than being buried under a finished floor, sits unassembled, its raw materials neither organized into darkness nor smoothed into a surface to stand on. Jung wrote that the shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality. This means that the shadow is not merely a collection of faults to hide, it is the unintegrated whole of who you have not yet become, demanding encounter rather than concealment. What happens then when that encounter cannot be with something buried because nothing was ever buried at all? And what does the psyche do with material that simply waits, unnamed and shapeless, for someone willing to approach it? There is a particular vertigo that belongs only to this experience, and it is not grief exactly, not depression in the clinical sense, not even loneliness as most people understand it. It is something quieter and stranger than any of those words can hold. When someone asks you who you are, you notice a half second of reaching, a hand extended toward a shelf that other people seem to find immediately, effortlessly, as though the contents were placed there long ago by someone who loved them. You find the shelf, but the objects on it feel provisional, like things you picked up somewhere along the road and arranged to look like belonging. What do you do with the suspicion that the self others carry was simply handed to them, assembled in advance by a lineage that knew what shape a person ought to take? And when that suspicion visits you at your most unguarded, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, in a conversation that should feel simple, what are you actually encountering? There is something quietly extraordinary waiting inside the condition you have been carrying, something that becomes visible only when you stop measuring structural absence against what others seem to possess and begin asking what absence, paradoxically, makes possible. When a self is inherited, it arrives pre-furnished, the values, the fears, the silences, the permissions, all installed before any conscious hand could arrange them. But what is built deliberately, chosen rather than absorbed, carries a coherence of an entirely different order, one that cannot be destabilized by the withdrawal of the source that provided it, because there was no such source to begin with. What does it actually demand of you, though, to build that way, to lay each stone without a blueprint handed down from those who came before? And what does the building cost, not in effort alone, but in the kind of courage that has no map to consult? The most searching answer is still to come. Stay with us as we descend into what individuation genuinely requires of the person who must practice it without a prior chart. Jung described individuation not as the project of improving yourself, but as the far stranger and more demanding process of becoming, for the first time, the self that was always latent inside you, the self that existed as potential before it existed as fact. This means that individuation is less about adding something new and more about excavating what was always there, waiting beneath the layers of what you were told to be. And here is what most accounts of this process omit. The person who was never handed a ready-made self is not behind in this work. They are, involuntarily and often painfully, already further along than those who received an identity pre-assembled and simply moved into it without questioning the walls. Think of the individuating person as a cartographer dropped into unmapped territory. Every other traveler has been given charts, however inaccurate, however hand-me-down. But you arrived with blank parchment, and the map you carry comes into existence only as you walk it, each step simultaneously a discovery and an inscription. The territory does not precede the walking. The walking is what makes the territory legible. This is the answer to what the deliberate building actually demands of the one who must attempt it. Cartographic courage without a prior chart, the willingness to treat the blankness itself as the starting condition rather than the obstacle. Here, then, is where the earlier question finds its answer, the question of what actually happens when the shadow arrives unassembled rather than buried. For most people, the shadow is a subterranean thing, pressed down beneath years of inherited persona, surfacing only in slips and projections and midnight anxieties that feel foreign to the self. But you never received that polished surface to press against. There was no thick layer of family-transmitted identity to hold the darker material in place, which means it does not arrive as a stranger knocking from below. It arrives as weather, sudden, atmospheric, difficult to locate in any single feeling or memory. Jung observed that the unconscious compensates whatever the conscious attitude fails to hold, and the more thinly the persona is constructed, the more directly that compensation appears. This means the psychic material that others experience as intrusion, you experience as proximity, an unsettling closeness to something vast and unnamed. This is not chaos, though it presents as chaos. How often do you feel overtaken by an emotion that seems to belong to no particular cause? And when that happens, do you find yourself searching for a wound that would explain it, only to find the wound is more like a door? The shadow, for you, is not pathology. It is nearness. There's a myth so old it feels less like a story and more like a memory, Prometheus, who climbed to the sun not for personal glory, but because humanity sat in darkness that the gods had decided was appropriate, and he could not accept that decision. He carried fire downward, not because it belonged to him, but because its absence from the world was a kind of violence he felt in his own body. And here is what the myth never quite says plainly. He was punished not for theft, but for revealing that the existing order had been withholding something essential. Does that arc feel familiar to you, the sense that you arrived carrying something the people around you had never been given, and that your very presence named an absence they preferred not to acknowledge? Have you been called too much, too intense, too presumptuous in your reaching, as though the fire in your hands was evidence of a crime rather than a transmission? The accusation of overreaching is almost always, beneath its surface, the accusation of knowing something the accuser has decided no one should need to know. There is a gift concealed inside this condition that almost no one names directly, because it looks from the outside like a disadvantage, and from the inside like a wound. The person who never received an unconscious script is the person who cannot be imprisoned by one. Where others carry inherited narratives they will spend decades trying to unravel, you carry open space, which is terrifying, yes, but also genuinely free. The most searching question is still to come. Stay with us as we ask what integration even means for someone with no prior self to return to. There's a word that gets used too freely in conversations about the inner life, and that word is return. Integration, as it is usually described, sounds like a homecoming, as though somewhere inside you there is an original self, dusty and waiting, and the work is simply to find your way back to it. But that framing does not belong to you. For you, there is no prior form to restore. What Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's capacity to hold two irreconcilable opposites until something genuinely new emerges from the tension between them, is not, in your case, a bridge between who you were and who you suppressed. This means it is something rarer and more demanding. It is the generative pressure that creates the vessel itself, for the first time, from material that has never been shaped before. Think of the glassblower, whose breath is the only thing standing between molten possibility and collapse. The glass has no memory of a previous form, no grooves that the new shape must honor or betray. One breath too shallow, and the whole thing folds inward on itself. One breath too forced, and it shatters against its own resistance. Only the steady, warm, continuous exhalation, patient, directional, neither timid nor violent, creates the vessel. That is what integration looks like when there is no prior self to return to. It is not restoration. It is the first and only breath. And what you receive, having done this, is something that cannot be taken away in the way that borrowed identities always eventually are. Because what was absorbed unconsciously from others holds only as long as the conditions that installed it remain stable. But what you have chosen and built, piece by deliberate piece, from the raw and unnamed material of your own interior, carries a different kind of weight entirely. Your relationship with your own darkness is no longer one of management, of keeping certain rooms locked and hoping no one notices the keys. It is something closer to knowledge, a conscious familiarity that transforms what was once threatening into what is simply true about you. And this produces a psychological authority that is genuinely yours, not loaned from a lineage, not borrowed from a role, not contingent on approval. Have you ever noticed how certain people seem to know themselves from the inside rather than the outside? How nothing you say about them seems to quite reach the core of how they stand. That is the posture of chosen coherence. There is a significant distance, one that cannot be closed by understanding alone, between the moment you grasp what integration means and the moment you actually begin to live inside it. And that distance is where most people quietly stall. Knowing the name of the country is not the same as crossing its border, and the architecture you have been mapping in your mind remains theoretical until something more specific, more embodied, more honest with you than a concept ever could be, gives you the first real foothold. What does that foothold actually look like for someone who has no prior self to return to as a landmark? And what does it demand of you that no inherited identity would ever have required? The most illuminating territory is still to come. Stay with us as we move into the specific concrete entry points where the building of a self shifts from something you understand into something you are actually doing. Think of the archaeologist at a dig site, not the excavator who tears through earth with a machine, but the one who kneels and works with a fine brush, patient and directional, reverent toward what is fragile and old, never forcing a shard into a shape it did not originally hold. That is the quality of attention this process asks of you, not violent self-interrogation, but the slow, careful separation of what is genuinely yours from what was absorbed, borrowed, or simply present in the air when you were young enough to mistake the surrounding atmosphere for your own interior. Jung observed that the unconscious compensates for whatever the conscious attitude excludes, which means that the unnamed material surfacing in you is not random noise, but precise information about what has been left out. In other words, the strange thoughts, the disproportionate reactions, the feelings that seem to belong to no particular story, these are not symptoms of disorder, but dispatches from the part of you that is still waiting to be acknowledged. The entry point is not a technique, but a posture, sitting with what arises before deciding what it means, allowing the unnamed to remain unnamed a little longer rather than collapsing it prematurely into a familiar category. And the relationships that support this process are not the ones that require a finished self as admission price, but the ones willing to accompany something still in formation, people who do not need you to be coherent yet, whose presence does not demand a performance of wholeness you have not yet assembled. And yet the entry point, once found, is only a threshold. It opens onto a question larger than any single practice can answer. The most quietly consequential turn is still to come. Stay with us as we arrive at what all this building has secretly been for. And here, at the deepest turn of the spiral, the answer to what you have been carrying finally becomes visible. Jung wrote that the realization of the self is always a defeat for the ego, and this means that the self you are building is not built by force of will or by the performance of certainty, but by the slow, humble willingness to let what is true displace what was merely assumed. Wholeness for you is not a room you eventually enter and rest inside. It is the act of laying the floor while standing on it, the construction itself, ongoing and alive. And that is not a consolation for incompleteness. That is the most precise form of completeness available to a conscious being. What you once experienced as structural absence, that vertiginous sense that the interior architecture others seem to simply inherit was never handed to you, turns out to have been the opening condition for something the world quietly needs. When someone who has built a self from nothing stands before another person who feels they have nothing to stand on, no philosophy bridges the distance between them the way that living proof does. The wound of your particular becoming is, without your having chosen it, the most generous thing you will ever offer. What you have encountered here, this strange, vertiginous territory of building rather than inheriting, of assembling a self from materials no one handed you, is not a journey that ends with a final word. I invite you to share your thoughts, your reflections, and your questions. What has this exploration revealed to you? Thanks for looking.